Well, welcome back for another of George MacDonald's Unspoken sermons. We're in his second sermon today. I would have done this recording outside in the Tarpling Woods like the last one, with how well that went. But there were hundreds, if not thousands, of birds hanging out there in the woods, making a bunch of racket, which is good and cute, but not good for recording. And it's also a bit blustery out there. So I figured I'd come inside and do the recording here at the kitchen table, which is just as well, because as I was pulling the thread of this sermon, I ended up finding a bunch of books I wanted to reference, which I don't need to haul out into the woods. There are enough leaves out there. Anyway, so we're talking about the consuming fire today, which you might remember was the ending of our first sermon, and he's tied it to the second sermon, and he'll do the same for all the other sermons. And he's talking about the quote from Hebrews, "Our God is a consuming fire," from Hebrews 12:29. And he starts by just kind of talking about the nature of love. There's a little sentence here at the beginning that I think is a really nice one and worth hearing. He says, "For if at the voice of entreaty love conquers displeasure, it is love asserting itself, not love yielding its claims." So how I took that was, if say you're doing something and like kind of asserting your will, if you will, and then someone entreats you to do otherwise, and it's kind of your displeasure to do otherwise, then by yielding yourself to their entreaty, it's love actually asserting itself. And I thought that was a really nice image. So it's hard for me to articulate for some reason, but that's probably all of MacDonald. It's all really dense. But I just thought that was lovely, so I'll read it once more. "For if at the voice of entreaty love conquers displeasure, it is love asserting itself, not love yielding its claims." Anyway, get something from that if you can, but I just thought it was lovely, and I'm going to have to mull over it some more before I feel like I can say anything about that. But he continues talking about love here for a second. "For love loves unto purity. Love has ever in view the absolute loveliness of that which it beholds. Where loveliness is incomplete, and love cannot love its fill of loving, it spins itself to make more lovely, that it may love more. It strives for perfection, even that itself may be perfected, not in itself, but in the object. As it was love that first created humanity, so even human love, in proportion to its divinity, will go on creating the beautiful for its own outpouring." We should definitely love people unconditionally, but if we can help them to be better in some way, and if they can help us be better in some way, then that is what we should be striving for. And Chesterton gets at this a little bit in Orthodoxy, where he is talking about patriotism and some other things, or where there's good and bad patriotism, and I might do a separate set of readings about that. But basically he says if you're loving your country for some of its imagined qualities, instead of just loving it because it's your country, then you can get into some sticky situations. But he continues on and brings it back towards talking about individuals, and specifically women. He says, "Some stupid people started the idea that because women obviously back up their own people through everything, therefore women are blind and do not see anything. They can hardly have known any women. The same women who are ready to defend their men through thick and thin are, in their personal intercourse with the man, almost morbidly lucid about the thinness of his excuses or the thickness of his head. A man's friend likes him but leaves him as he is. His wife loves him and is always trying to turn him into somebody else." He continues on later to say, "The devotee is entirely free to criticize. The fanatic can safely be a skeptic. Love is not blind. That is the last thing that it is. Love is bound. And the more that it is bound, the less it is blind." And I think that's lovely. And maybe counter to today's culture a bit, but that's what MacDonald is saying here about love. is that love will strive for perfection in you so that it can love you more. But we'll continue on, and he's going to talk about truth now. If this be hard to understand, it is as the simple absolute truth is hard to understand. It may be centuries of ages before a man comes to see a truth, ages of strife, of effort, of aspiration. But when once he does see it, it is so plain that he wonders he could have lived without seeing it. That he did not understand it sooner was simply and only that he did not see it. To see a truth, to know what it is, to understand it, and to love it are all one. There is many emotion towards it, many a misery for want of it, many a cry of the conscience against the neglect of it, many a dim longing for it as an unknown need, before at length the eyes come awake, and the darkness of the dreamful night yields to the light of the sun of truth. But once beheld, it is forever. For this vision of truth God has been working for ages of ages. For this simple condition, this apex of life, upon which a man wonders like a child that he cannot make other men see as he sees, the whole labor of God's science, history, and poetry, from the time when the earth gathered itself into a lonely drop of fire from the red rim of the driving sun-wheel, to the time when Alexander John Scott worshipped him from its face, was evolving truth upon truth in lovely vision, in torturing law, never lying, never repenting. And for this will the patience of God labor, while there is yet a human soul whose eyes have not been opened, whose child heart has not yet been born in him. So I think that's a lovely way of connecting love and truth. He's saying love seeks the perfection of its object, and so God will ever strive to perfect truth and knowledge in his children. So I think that's nice, but how is that enacted? And that's where it gets a little less pleasant than talking about truth and love, because again, we're talking about a consuming fire, and that doesn't sound very pleasant. He says, "He is a consuming fire, that only that which cannot be consumed may stand forth eternal. It is the nature of God, so terribly pure that it destroys all that is not pure as fire, which demands like purity in our worship. He will have purity. It is not that the fire will burn us if we do not worship thus, but that the fire will burn us until we worship thus. Yea, will go on burning within us after all that is foreign to it has yielded to its force, no longer with pain and consuming, but as the highest consciousness of life, the presence of God. When evil, which alone is consumable, shall have passed away in his fire from the dwellers in the immovable kingdom, the nature of man shall look the nature of God in the face, and his fear shall then be pure. For an eternal, that is, a holy fear, must spring from a knowledge of the nature, not from a sense of the power." So, God will burn our impurities, our evilness away, which will be uncomfortable, but then it'll continue burning in us as a fire of life. For holy fear must spring from a knowledge of the nature, not from a sense of the power. I think that is a key takeaway there. But he talks a bit about why the author of Hebrews uses the words consuming fire. And he gets back to that idea of fear in a second. He says the symbol of the consuming fire would seem to have been suggested to the writer by the fire that burned on the mountain of the old law, aka Mount Sinai. And I had to look into this a little bit. I looked up what exactly all happened at Mount Sinai, because apparently there was a lot. And he talks in Exodus 19 about how God's going to come down to Mount Sinai and have a chat with Moses, and the people's response to that and what they saw and how they responded to what they saw. In Exodus 19:9, he says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, in order that the people may hear when I speak with you, and so trust you ever after." So he's going to give them examples, say, yes, this is actually God talking to Moses, so you should just trust Moses when he tells you stuff in the future. And so when God comes down to do this talking, there's thunder and lightning and a thick cloud on the mountain and a blast as of a trumpet so loud that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And there's smoke, the mountain shook, and a whole bunch of other stuff happening. So all of this is there just to prove that God's presence is there. But how do the people handle that? See, I think I turned the page. Yeah. When all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid and trembled, and stood at a distance, and said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, or we will die." So they were terrified about what they saw on the mountain, and that's what MacDonald's going to get to here in a second. So they're on the mountain, and they are terrified about the representation of God that they saw. And how is that good? How is terror a good way to represent God? It seems counterintuitive to how we like to view God. God is love. MacDonald says that in the state of humanity at that time, and the Israelites in particular, they're in a position where the best thing that they could understand was terror. He says of God that he will not put on a mask, he puts on a face. He will not speak out of flaming fire if that flaming fire is alien to him, if there is nothing in him for that flaming fire to reveal. Be his children ever so brutish, he will not terrify them with a lie. So now he's going to talk a little bit about how that fire on the mountaintop is a revelation, but it's a partial revelation, and how that is still a legitimate revelation. And he has a really interesting and lovely thoughts about that, I think. So I'm just going to probably read a lot of this. He says, "It was a revelation, but a partial one, a true symbol, not a final vision. No revelation can be other than partial. If for true revelation a man must be told all the truth, then farewell to revelation, yea, farewell to sonship. For what revelation other than a partial can the highest spiritual condition receive of the infinite God? But it is not therefore untrue because it is partial. Only, whatever it might reveal, if its nature were such as to preclude development and growth, thus chaining the man to his incompleteness, it would be but a false revelation, fighting against all the divine laws of human existence. The true revelation rouses the desire to know more by the truth of its incompleteness. Here was a nation at its lowest. Could it receive anything but a partial revelation, a revelation of fear?" So then he talks about the value that that fear had for the Israelites there as a starting point for further growth towards God. "Such as they were, they did well to be afraid. They were in a better condition, acknowledging if only a terror above them, flaming on that unknown mountain height, then stooping to worship the idol below them. Fear is nobler than sensuality. Fear is better than no God, better than a God made with hands. In that fear lay deep hidden the sins of the infinite. The worship of fear is true, although very low, and though not acceptable to God in itself, for only worship of spirit and of truth is acceptable to him, yet even in his sight it is precious. For he regards men not as they are merely, but as they shall be, not as they shall be merely, but as they are now growing, or capable of growing, towards that image after which he made them, that they might grow to it." It's a lot, but he's saying that the fear of the unknown and the mysterious is a first and baby step towards their growth into better Christians and better knowing God. And that growth can go in either directions, as he continues on and kind of points out here. "Therefore, 1,000 stages, each in itself all but valueless, are of inestimable worth as the necessary and connected gradations of an infinite progress. A condition which of declension would indicate a devil may of growth indicate a saint." And that reminds me of what Charles Williams was saying in our video from the Descent into Hell on the other series. And he's talking about how that character is just having dreams that he's going hand over fist down a rope, and those small, like kind of infinitely small movements that are happening every day of his life as he steers towards selfishness and away from community are the handholds that take him farther and farther down into hell. And so that's kind of what he's saying here, which I thought was nice. So we're going to get back to the idea of burning now. He says, "Can it be any comfort to them to be told that God loves them so that he will burn them clean? Can the cleansing of the fire appear to them anything beyond what it must always, more or less, be, a process of torture? They do not want to be clean, and they cannot bear to be tortured. Can they then do other, or can we desire that they should do other, than fear God? Even with the fear of the wicked, until they learn to love him with the love of the holy. To them Mount Sinai is crowned with the signs of vengeance. And is not God ready to do unto them even as they fear, though with another feeling and a different end from which they are capable of supposing? He is against sin, insofar as, and while they and sin are one, he is against them, against their desires, their aims, their fears, and their hopes. And thus he is altogether and always for them. That thunder and lightning and tempest, that blackness torn with the sound of a trumpet, that visible horror bellowed with the voice of words, was all but a faint image to the senses of the slaves of what God thinks and feels against vileness and selfishness, of the unrest of unassuageable repulsion with which he regards such conditions, that so the stupid people, fearing somewhat to do as they would, might leave a little room for that grace to grow in them, which would at length make them see that evil, and not fire, is the fearful thing. Yea, so transform them that they would gladly rush up into the trumpet blast of Sinai to escape the flutes around the golden calf. Could they have understood this, they would have needed no Mount Sinai. It was a true, and of necessity a partial revelation, partial in order to be true." What a beautiful image, though, that if they did see everything aright, the Israelites would have fled from the lovely flutes surrounding the golden calf at the bottom of Mount Sinai and up into the tempest and the trumpet blast. But they needed a partial revelation to get them one step closer to being able to understand the reality. But this idea of true but partial revelations remind me of something that Dr. Jerry Root said to me when I was sitting in on a class that he was teaching. He said it, and I'm sure many other people have said it as well. He said, if you had several people who had never seen an elephant be blindfolded and try to figure out what that elephant was, they would each kind of tell a different story depending on what they were feeling. So one's grabbing the leg, he would say it feels like a tree. Another one would say it feels like a snake because he's touching the trunk. Another one would say it feels like a fan because he's touching the ears. All true things, but the reality is much larger than each of their partial revelations. But each of their revelations is true, and that's kind of what this reminded me of. And that's how I feel about religion often. But anyway, I digress. So he's talking about partial revelations and how they can be true. And he goes on to say, besides, they only can receive the doctrine who have ears to hear. If the selfish man could believe it, he would misinterpret it, but he cannot believe it. It is not possible that he should. But the loving soul, oppressed by wrong teaching, or partial truth claiming to be the whole, will hear, understand, and rejoice. For when we say that God is love, do we teach men that their fear of him is groundless? No, as much as they fear will come upon them, possibly far more. But there is something beyond their fear, a divine fate which they cannot withstand, because it works along with the human individuality which the divine individuality has created in them. The wrath will consume what they call themselves, so that the selves God made shall appear, coming out with tenfold consciousness of being, and bringing with them all that made the blessedness of the life the men tried to lead without God. They will know that now first are they fully themselves. The avaricious, weary, selfish, suspicious old men shall have passed away. The young, ever young self will remain. That which they thought themselves shall have vanished. That which they felt themselves, though they misjudged their own feelings, shall remain. Remain glorified in repentant hope. For that which cannot be shaken shall remain. That which is immortal in God shall remain in man. The death that is in them shall be consumed. It is the law of nature, that is, the law of God, that all that is destructible shall be destroyed. So, again, talking about burning away the selfish and the evil, and how we will be our truer selves after that. If still he cling to that which can be burned, the burning goes on deeper and deeper into his bosom, till it reaches the roots of the falsehood that enslaves him, possibly by looking like the truth. And we'll get back to that later. This is a good actually one to kind of do at the beginning of the sermons, because a good bit of what MacDonald's says flies in the face of common interpretations of Scripture. But what is evident is that he is very well steeped in Scripture himself. So we can assess what we can from that. All right, so we've been talking about how God can burn away the impurities in us. But what happens if we resist this? He gets to that here. If the man resists the burning of God, the consuming fire of love, a terrible doom awaits him, and its day will come. He shall be cast into the outer darkness who hates the fire of God. What sick dismay shall then seize upon him? For let a man think and care ever so little about God, he does not therefore exist without God. God is here with him, upholding, warming, delighting, teaching him, making life a good thing to him. God gives him himself, though he knows it not. But when God withdraws from a man as far as that can be without the man ceasing to be, when the man feels himself abandoned, hanging in a ceaseless vertigo of existence, upon the verge of the gulf of his being, without support, without refuge, without aim, without end, for the soul has no weapons wherewith to destroy herself, with no inbreathing of joy, with nothing to make life good, then he will be ready to rush into the very heart of the consuming fire, to know life once more, to change this terror of sick negation, of unspeakable death, for the region of painful hope. Imagination cannot mislead us into too much horror of being without God. So if you were afraid that MacDonald was too much of a universalist, here you have a clear depiction of hell, the absence of God, and being abandoned, hanging in a ceaseless vertigo of existence upon the verge of the gulf of his being, without support, without refuge. And he continues on with that idea down here, but he puts a different spin on it. He says there's one difference, and that is the outer darkness is but the most dreadful form of the consuming fire. The fire without light, the darkness visible, which is a reference to Paradise Lost, I assume, or they're both referencing something else, I'm unsure. But so, this fire without light, this darkness visible, the black flame, God hath withdrawn himself, but not lost his hold. His face is turned away, but his hand is laid upon him still. His heart has ceased to beat into the man's heart, but he keeps him alive by his fire, and that fire will go searching and burning on in him, as in the highest saint who is not yet pure as he is pure. And then here is where we get a bit more unorthodox still, and his universalism comes back. He says, "But at length, O God, wilt thou not cast death and hell into the lake of fire, even into thine own consuming self? Death shall then die everlastingly, and hell itself will pass away, and leave her dolorous mansions to the peering day. Then indeed wilt thou be all in all, For then our poor brothers and sisters, every one, O God, we trust in thee, the consuming fire, shall have been burnt clean and brought home. For if their moans, myriads of ages away, would turn heaven for us into hell, shall a man be more merciful than God? Shall, of all his glories, his mercy alone not be infinite? Shall a brother love a brother more than the Father loves the Son? More than the brother Christ loves his brother? Would he not die yet again to save one brother more? As for us, now will we come to thee, our consuming fire, and thou wilt not burn us more than we can bear, but thou wilt burn us. And although thou seem to slay us, yet will we trust in thee, even from that which thou hast not spoken, if by any means at length we may attain unto the blessedness of those who have not seen and yet have believed. And that's the end. That's the verse that we start the next sermon with, which is great. But going up a bit to that powerful line, or those lines, for if their moans would turn heaven for us into hell, shall a man be more merciful than God? Shall of all his glories, his mercy alone not be infinite? I wrote boom in the margins there, because that's just a very powerful statement and a very kind of convicting one. And it does seem counterintuitive if we say that God is love, that he would, having infinite power and stuff, just abandon anyone to hell permanently. And that's obviously a very off-putting idea, that you could have finite errors here on earth driven by nature and nurture into an infinite hell. I can understand MacDonald's discomfort with that statement. But there is an extension of this idea that comes forward in Lewis. So this is universalism. Everyone will be saved eventually, and later he'll talk, I think, about how God would not stop until he's reclaimed like all his souls from hell. And I think that's a lovely idea. But Lewis takes it and he depicts it similarly in The Great Divorce. He has his little bus stop in hell that can take anybody who wants to go from hell into heaven. They can hop on this bus and go there. But when they get there, they learn that they don't want to be there, that they prefer the selfishness that is fostered in hell. And so they hop back on the bus and go back to hell. So that's one thing that MacDonald doesn't really talk about explicitly yet. He doesn't cover the idea that humans might choose to stay in hell. And I can see why he wouldn't think that is a possibility, given the way he described the absence of God with the vertigo, like a vertigo of existence upon the verge of the gulf of his being. That's obviously not something that people would choose, but as Lewis very wisely points out, people will happily choose themselves over most other people in their natural state. So in case y'all didn't know this, George MacDonald actually comes into the book The Great Divorce as a character. Lewis, who's quite a fanboy of him, meets him while he's touring heaven, essentially, and MacDonald elucidates the idea of hell for Lewis in this book. Because MacDonald's functioning as kind of a guide, like a Virgil or Beatrice from Dante. And after Lewis fanboys out for a bit, saying he loves Fantastes and stuff, MacDonald checks him and says, we have better things to do than talk about this, besides I know it all anyway. And then he goes on to talk about how hell looks in The Great Divorce, which is, of course, not supposed to be in any way literal, just imaginative. I'm going to try an accent, so forgive me if it's horribly insulting, because MacDonald was Scottish. Did you ever hear of the refrigerium? A man with your advantages might have read of it in Prudentius, not to mention Jeremy Taylor. The name is familiar, sir, but I'm afraid I've forgotten what it means. It means that the damned have holidays, excursions, you understand. Excursions to this country? aka heaven. So the damned have excursions to heaven. For those that will take them. Of course, most of the silly creatures don't. They prefer taking trips back to earth. They go and play tricks on the poor daft women you call mediums. They go and try to assert their ownership of some house that once belonged to them, and then you get what's called a haunting. Or they go to spy on their children, or literary ghosts hang about the public libraries to see if anyone's still reading their books. But if they come here, they can really stay? Aye, you'll have heard that the Emperor Trajan did. But I don't understand. Is the judgment not final? Is there really a way out of hell into heaven? It depends on the way you're using the words. If they leave that grey town behind, it will not have been hell. To any that leaves it, it is purgatory. And perhaps ye had better not call this country heaven. Not deep heaven, you understand. Here he smiled at me. You can call it the valley of the shadow of life. And yet to those who stay here, it will have been heaven from the first. And ye can call those sad streets in the town yonder the valley of the shadow of death. But to those who remain, they will have been hell even from the beginning. I suppose he saw that I looked puzzled, for presently he spoke again. Son, he said, ye cannot in your present state understand eternity. When Anados looked through the door of the timeless, he brought no message back. And that, of course, is a reference to MacDonald's book, Fantastes, with the main character, Anados. And in it, I won't talk about it, but he goes and looks through the timeless, and that's the one door he doesn't report back from, because he goes through other doors as well. But I think that's fun that Lewis is writing MacDonald, talking about MacDonald's books in Lewis's book. That's a great little addition there. I'll skip over a bit that he talks about there, but he continues on. MacDonald does. And he says, Hush, he said sternly. Do not blaspheme. Hell is a state of mind. You never said a truer word. And every state of mind left to itself, every shutting up of the creature within the dungeons of its own mind, is in the end hell. But heaven is not a state of mind. Heaven is reality itself, and all that is fully real is heavenly. For all that can be shaken will be shaken, and only the unshakable remains. There is a real choice after death? My Roman Catholic friends would be surprised, for to them souls in purgatory are already saved, and my Protestant friends would like it no better, for they'd say that the tree lies as it falls. They are both right, maybe. Do not fash yourself with such questions. You cannot fully understand the relations of choice and time till you are beyond both. And I'll stop there. I think that's a nice little bit that he adds there. Do not fash yourself with such questions. Don't worry yourself. Fashing, this is a fun aside. There is a Scottish saying, I guess, like don't fash your beard. It means like don't rub your beard. It means like don't stress over it. Don't worry about it, because that's what you do as a guy when you're stressed. You pull on your beard. I know this all too well due to the shape of my beard, because I pull on it on this side too much when I'm stressed. That's cool. Anyway, so he says, don't fash yourself with such questions. You can't understand them. And I think that goes back nicely to something that C.S. Lewis says in Mere Christianity, something that I took to heart and was comforted by when I first read it a long time ago. He's talking about hope in his chapter on it, and he's kind of giving a refutation to an argument. It's not a straw man, because he's not saying it too seriously. The people themselves can't be seriously if they're making this argument, but what he says afterwards is, I think, helpful. He says, there is no need to be worried by facetious people who try to make the Christian hope of heaven ridiculous by saying that they do not want to spend eternity playing harps. The answer to such people is that if they cannot understand books written for grown-ups, they should not talk about them. All the scriptural imagery, harps, crowns, gold, etc., is, of course, a merely symbolical attempt to express the inexpressible. Musical instruments are mentioned because for many people, not all, music is the thing known in the present life which most strongly suggests ecstasy and infinity. Crowns are mentioned to suggest the fact that those who are united with God in eternity share his splendor and power and joy. Gold is mentioned to suggest the timelessness of heaven. Gold doesn't rust. And the preciousness of it. People who take these symbols literally might as well think that when Christ told us to be like doves, he meant that we were to lay eggs. I think that's a great place to end. I think that's something that is helpful for us to hear, that we can quarrel over all of these nuances about the afterlife, or we can just understand that it is beyond our understanding, just as God is, and respect and appreciate one another in the meantime. Anyway, I think the main takeaway from this sermon, there's so many key points in it, but I think that MacDonald is saying that love and God, who is love, will try to perfect the object of its love. And in our case, that's us. In God's eyes, he wants to perfect us, and in MacDonald's mind, he will continue to pursue us even in hell, as it were, and try to reclaim us to himself. And that sounds great. And I guess if we go back to Chesterton, he says that love is not blind, love is bound. And if we say that God is love, then God is bound to us, his children. And in MacDonald's eyes, he's also bound to restore us to himself. Anyway, so we'll see what we have for next week, but hope that was somewhat understandable. Cheers. But that's what MacDonald's is saying. All one. There is many a motion towards it, many a misery for want of it. His ideas are quite lovely and beautiful. But anyway, Chippy, it's just a camera. All right.